Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, November 1943. Outside the tall windows of the Allegheny Conservatory of Music, steel mills pump gray smoke into an already gray sky, their forges working triple shifts to feed the war machine grinding through Europe and the Pacific. The air tastes of coal dust and distant burning, familiar flavors in a city that prides itself on fueling America's arsenal. Inside Dean Harrington's oak-paneled office, the atmosphere is different but equally oppressive, thick with unspoken anxieties and institutional dread. On the dean's mahogany desk, positioned precisely in the center of a leather blotter, sits a withdrawal form filled out in unfamiliar handwriting. The letters slant awkwardly, as if written by someone whose hand was shaking. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore, underscore. The signature is hurried, shaky, 3 quick strokes that barely resemble the careful penmanship Virgil normally employed. Piano instructor Elwood Percival Whitmore stares at the document and feels ice crawl up his spine, vertebra by vertebra, until his neck feels frozen and he cannot turn away from the page. 3 days ago, his most talented student, Virgil Brenner, performed Brahms' Intermezzo in A major at a private recital, speaking between movements about the profound German musical tradition. Yesterday, 2 men in dark suits arrived at the dean's office asking questions. Today, Virgil is gone. His boarding house room is empty. His landlady says federal agents came at dawn. His mother in Wheeling received a telegram, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 1, underscore, underscore. But Virgil had been rejected from military service due to childhood rheumatic fever. He could barely walk upstairs without losing his breath. He would never survive basic training. Elwood opens the conservatory's administrative files and begins counting. Over the past 23 months, since December 1941, 19 students have voluntarily withdrawn from the program. All of them after performing German repertoire with what someone deemed excessive passion. All of them from families with German surnames. Schumann, Weber, Brahms, even Bach, performed with too much reverence, too much cultural pride, too much connection to the old country. 19 young musicians, and not one has surfaced in any orchestra, teaching position, or even church choir since their departure. They didn't transfer to other schools. They didn't return home. They simply vanished from the musical world as if they had never drawn breath to sing, never placed fingers on ivory keys. What happens to students who dare to honor the music of their ancestors during a war against the fatherland? Elwood Percival Whitmore was 46 years old in the autumn of 1943. Born in 1897 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, when the steel mills still employed his father's generation of German immigrants, he grew up in a household where Schiller was quoted at dinner and Beethoven's sonatas echoed from the front parlor every Sunday afternoon. His mother, Greta Hoffmann, before marriage, had studied piano in Leipzig before emigrating in 1889. She taught young Elwood to play, and by age 8 he could navigate Mozart variations with such precision that the local Lutheran congregation asked him to accompany their hymns. Then came the Great War. When America entered in April 1917, Elwood was 20 years old, a scholarship student at the Philadelphia Conservatory on Locust Street, living in a cramped dormitory room that smelled of linseed oil and ambition. The city turned hostile overnight, transforming with a speed that terrified him. German street names were systematically changed. Germantown Avenue became Liberty Avenue in some neighborhoods, though the old name persisted stubbornly in others. Sauerkraut became quote 3 on restaurant menus. Hamburgers were renamed quote 4. His mother, Greta Hoffmann Whitmore, stopped speaking German in public after a grocer on South Street spat at her feet and called her a Hun, though she had left Germany in 1889, nearly 30 years before the war began. The conservatory quietly removed several German composers from required repertoire lists, replacing Brahms with Debussy, Schumann with Fauré. The administration issued a memorandum suggesting that students focus on underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, quote, underscore, underscore for the duration of the conflict, though what constituted American musical tradition remained conveniently undefined. Students with German surnames faced suspicion from classmates. sometimes worse. Elwood witnessed a fellow student, Klaus Zimmermann, beaten behind the dormitory by three men wearing makeshift American flag armbands who accused him of being a Hun spy. They broke Klaus's left hand with a brick, ending his promising career as a concert pianist before it began. Klaus left school the next week. The Philadelphia police investigated perfunctorily, took statements, and closed the case with no arrests. The attackers had been patriots, after all, defending America from internal enemies. What could the law say about that? After the war ended, Elwood completed his studies and could have pursued a concert career. His technique was flawless, his interpretive depth remarkable for someone so young. But instead, he chose teaching. A position opened at the Allegheny Conservatory in Pittsburgh, a city with a substantial German population working the steel mills and coal mines. He accepted, thinking perhaps he could create a space where German musical heritage could survive the suspicion and hatred that had poisoned Philadelphia. For 22 years, he taught piano to aspiring musicians in a fourth-floor studio overlooking Liberty Avenue. Every morning he arrived early, practicing scales on the conservatory's Steinway Grand, ironically manufactured by a German immigrant family in New York. Then came his students. Nervous freshmen, cocky juniors, exhausted seniors preparing graduation recitals. He corrected their fingering, explained phrasing, taught them to feel music rather than merely execute notes. He was known as demanding but fair. His students won regional competitions, secured teaching positions, some even joined symphony orchestras in Chicago and Boston. He took quiet pride in their achievements, never seeking credit or recognition. Elwood had never married. There had been a girl once, Sarah Mitchell, during his time in Philadelphia. But her father forbade the match when the Great War began. Wouldn't have his daughter marry a man with a German mother, regardless of Elwood's American birth. After that, there were occasional brief romances, but nothing substantial. Music filled his life completely, leaving little room for romantic entanglements. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the north side, 3 rooms overlooking the Allegheny River. Evenings, he played for himself, Liszt, Brahms, sometimes improvising variations on German folk songs his mother had taught him in childhood. But these he played quietly, with windows closed. Such music had become dangerous to play aloud, especially now, with the Second War raging. Virgil Brenner entered Elwood's studio in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. He was 19, arriving from Wheeling, West Virginia, son of a coal mine foreman and a seamstress. Tall, painfully thin, with the long fingers of a natural pianist and an intensity in his gray eyes that suggested old soul wisdom. At his audition, he performed Beethoven's __6__ sonata, and Elwood immediately recognized something rare: technique married to genuine emotional depth. Virgil didn't merely play notes, he told stories. Each phrase carried meaning, each rest breathed with purpose. The admissions committee accepted him unanimously, and Elwood requested Virgil be assigned to his studio. For 2 years, Virgil studied flawlessly. He arrived at the studio before any other student and stayed after everyone left. He practiced passages hundreds of times, pursuing perfect clarity of tone. He absorbed Elwood's instruction with respectful attention, never questioning, never challenging. Yet something in him remained stubbornly individual, an inner core of independence that occasionally surfaced in his playing. Once, Elwood assigned him Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Virgil performed it with such aching longing that Elwood found himself unable to breathe. The music spoke of something irretrievably lost, a homeland that no longer existed, a freedom stolen away, an identity forcibly erased. When the final chord dissolved into silence, Elwood sat frozen for several heartbeats before speaking quietly. Excellent technique. But in the recital, play it more restrainedly. Don't reveal how deeply you feel. It's dangerous to show such emotion. Virgil nodded. He understood without explanation. In September 1943, during his junior year, Virgil began changing. He grew distracted, absent-minded. Several times, Elwood noticed him reading mimeographed pages that he quickly concealed when his instructor entered. Finally, Elwood asked directly, "What are you reading?" Virgil hesitated, then answered, "Essays about German philosophy. Goethe, Schiller, Heine. Someone's circulating them. They're not in the library anymore. The administration removed them after Pearl Harbor, but students are copying and sharing them secretly." Elwood felt alarm spike through him. Circulating pro-German materials during wartime could bring serious consequences. "Be careful," Elwood warned. "I know," Virgil replied, but his eyes held a fire Elwood recognized from his own youth, a flame that warnings couldn't extinguish. In October, a student named Clement Fisher organized what they called a __quote_12__ unofficial evening gatherings where musicians performed repertoire that wouldn't be welcomed on the public stage. These took place in the basement of an old brownstone near the conservatory, attended by students, young artists, writers. Elwood knew about such gatherings but never attended. Many faculty members knew and remained silent, as long as matters didn't become too obvious. Virgil asked Elwood's permission to perform there. "What will you play?" Elwood asked. "Brahms' Intermezzo in A major, and I want to speak briefly about the German Romantic tradition before I play." Elwood went cold. Speaking publicly about German culture during the war, praising German artistic achievement while American boys died fighting Germans in North Africa and Italy, this was beyond reckless. "Don't," Elwood said quietly. "It's too dangerous." "I must," Virgil answered. And Elwood saw in his eyes a determination that couldn't be deflected. He could have forbidden it, could have threatened expulsion, but he didn't. Because once, he had been like this, and because somewhere deep inside, part of his soul had never surrendered to fear. "Then play it beautifully," he said, and released his student. The recital happened on a Friday evening in late October. Elwood didn't attend, but he heard about it the next day from Mabel Kress, another piano student who had been there. "Quote 19, quote," she told him, her voice trembling with emotion. Elwood listened, ice spreading through his chest. Mabel continued. Elwood asked. Elwood felt his stomach drop. Federal agents had been monitoring such gatherings, looking for sedition, fifth column activities, anything that smacked of disloyalty. A few patriotic denunciations and careers could be destroyed, lives ruined. That night, Elwood couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to freight trains rumbling along the river, carrying steel and coal to feed the war machine. He thought about Virgil, brilliant and doomed, standing before an audience to defend German culture in the middle of a war against Germany. Courage or foolishness? Principle or naivety? Elwood didn't know anymore. On Monday morning, Virgil came to his regular lesson at 10 o'clock, precisely on time as always. He seemed calm, even happy, lighter somehow than Elwood had seen him in months. The November sunlight streamed through the studio windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like notes suspended in silence. "Thank you for not forbidding me," Virgil said, settling onto the piano bench and flexing his fingers in the habitual warm-up gesture Elwood knew so well. "I needed to say what I believe. I needed to play that music and explain why it matters. Even if no one else understands, I understand now. Music isn't about nations or politics. It's about truth. And I spoke truth on Friday night. Whatever happens, I spoke truth." Elwood felt dread coiling in his stomach like a cold snake. "Virgil, listen to me carefully. You need to be prepared for—" Before he could finish, there was a knock on the studio door. Not the tentative tap of a student, but an authoritative rap that made the frosted glass rattle in its frame. Dean Harrington entered without waiting for permission, his face pale as old newspaper, his hands trembling slightly. Behind him came two men in dark suits and narrow ties, wearing expressions of bureaucratic indifference that Elwood recognized from newsreels about federal investigations. "Mr. Brenner," the dean said, his voice barely above a whisper. "These gentlemen are from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They need to speak with you. Please go with them. Virgil stood slowly, carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter something fragile in the air between them. He looked at Elwood, and for a moment their eyes met. Elwood saw acceptance there, resignation, but also something like peace. The serenity of someone who had made a choice and would stand by it regardless of consequence.
"Thank you for teaching me, Professor Whitmore," Virgil said quietly, his voice steady.
You showed me that music is worth everything. I won't forget that. Virgil, Elwood started, but one of the agents stepped forward. Mr. Brenner, please come with us now. We have some questions regarding your activities and associations. Virgil nodded. He walked toward the door with his head up, shoulders back, moving with the dignity of someone who knew he had nothing to be ashamed of. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Elwood one last time. Keep teaching them to play honestly, he said. That's the only thing that matters. Then he was gone, footsteps receding down the hallway, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Elwood stood frozen in his studio, listening to the silence that rushed in to fill the space Virgil had occupied. Through the window, he could hear the distant clangor of steel mills, the hiss of steam, the rumble of freight trains carrying coal and iron to feed the war. The ordinary sounds of Pittsburgh continuing its ordinary business while his student was led away to an extraordinary fate. He never saw Virgil Brenner again. The investigation was handled quietly, as such matters always were during the war. No public announcement, no newspaper stories. The conservatory administration informed students that Virgil had withdrawn for family reasons. His name was removed from the roster. His photograph disappeared from the student directory. It was as if he had never existed. Elwood made discreet inquiries through colleagues. One contact at the Department of Justice mentioned that several young men of German descent had been relocated for the duration, sent to internment camps similar to those holding Japanese Americans, though less publicized. Others were simply drafted regardless of medical exemptions, their records altered to show fitness for service. Some ended up in labor battalions, working mines or farms far from cities, under supervision. A few were investigated for sedition, their families harassed, their futures destroyed by association. Elwood never learned Virgil's specific fate. The file was sealed, the case classified. Virgil Brenner simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. In the weeks following Virgil's disappearance, Elwood felt himself drowning in guilt. He had known the danger. He could have forbidden the performance, could have protected his student. Instead, he had given tacit approval, had essentially sent Virgil into the hands of those who would destroy him. At night, Elwood sat at his piano, hands hovering over the keys, unable to play. The music felt poisoned now, contaminated by complicity. He had taught Virgil to love German music, had nurtured that passion, had praised his interpretive depth. And then, he had let him walk into a trap. Other students came to lessons, oblivious or pretending to be. Elwood taught mechanically, correcting technique, assigning pieces, but the joy had gone out of it. Every time a student played Brahms or Schumann, he thought of Virgil. Every time he praised someone's emotional connection to the music, he wondered if he was setting them up for the same fate. In December, another student disappeared. Estelle Vogel, a soprano, had sung, quote, 37 from Schubert's Winterreise at a church concert. She translated the German lyrics into English, but the song's melancholy longing for the old country was unmistakable. 2 days later, her dormitory room was empty. Her family in Lancaster received a brief notice. She had been transferred to essential war work in a classified location. Letters returned unopened. By spring of 1944, 4 more students had vanished, all musicians of German descent. All had performed German repertoire with what authorities deemed excessive enthusiasm or cultural identification. The pattern was undeniable, yet no one spoke of it openly. The conservatory operated under a pall of fear. Students with German surnames kept their heads down, avoided German composers, anglicized their names when possible. The vibrant musical community Elwood had known for 2 decades withered into suspicious silence. Elwood continued teaching, but he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He went through the motions, scales, etudes, recitals, but the meaning had drained away. Music, which had been his salvation, his purpose, his refuge from a hostile world, now felt like a betrayal. How could he teach students to love music when that love could destroy them? How could he nurture passion when passion led to persecution? In June 1944, a new student arrived at the conservatory. Her name was Mabel Kress, 19 years old, from a farming family in western Pennsylvania. Her surname wasn't German, but her mother's maiden name was Mueller. She played piano with technical competence but emotional restraint, as if afraid to feel too deeply. During their first lesson, Elwood assigned her Schumann's Kinderszenen. She played it correctly but coldly, each note precise but empty of meaning. "You're holding back," Elwood said gently. "The music needs warmth, tenderness. These are childhood scenes. Let yourself remember innocence, wonder." Mabel's hands trembled slightly. __quote_40__. Elwood looked at this frightened girl, and something broke inside him. All these years of silence, of complicity, of teaching students to suppress their truth in exchange for safety. What had it achieved? Virgil had disappeared anyway. Estelle was gone. 19 students lost. And for what? Because he had been too cowardly to speak, too afraid to fight. Quote 41, he heard himself say. Quote 42. Mabel stared at him, eyes wide. Quote 43. Quote 44, Elwood said quietly. Quote 45. Mabel was silent for a long moment. Then she turned back to the piano and played the Kinderszenen again. This time, emotion flooded through the notes. Sadness, joy, nostalgia, loss. The music breathed and sang and wept. When she finished, tears streamed down her face. __quote_46__, Elwood said softly. That night, Elwood made a decision. He would no longer be complicit in the erasure of truth. He would teach his students to play with honesty, to honor the music regardless of the composer's nationality, to refuse the lie that art could be separated from the cultures that created it. If this brought consequences, so be it. He had already lost too much by choosing safety over integrity. Over the following months, Elwood quietly changed his teaching approach. He continued assigning German repertoire, Beethoven, Brahms, Schumann, Bach. But now he spoke openly about the cultural context, the philosophical traditions, the linguistic beauty that informed the music. He encouraged students to research the composers' lives, to understand the historical moments that shaped their art. He taught them that music transcends nationalism precisely because it emerges from specific cultural traditions. That honoring German musical heritage didn't make one disloyal to America, but rather demonstrated commitment to artistic truth over political expedience. Some students embraced this approach. Others, frightened, transferred to different instructors. The conservatory administration received complaints from parents worried about their children's association with __quote. _47__, Dean Harrington called Elwood to his office in September 1944. The dean said carefully. Elwood replied evenly. Harrington said. Elwood said. Harrington sighed. Elwood repeated bitterly. The dean had no answer. The meeting ended inconclusively, with Harrington warning Elwood to be careful, and Elwood knowing he wouldn't be. That evening, Elwood returned to his apartment and sat at his upright piano, a modest instrument compared to the conservatory's Steinway, but it had been his mother's, brought from her family home in Bethlehem when she married his father. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. Not scales or exercises, but music he had suppressed for years. Brahms' Intermezzo in A major, the piece Virgil had performed before vanishing. Schumann's Träumerei, which Estelle had loved. Bach's Goldberg Variations, which his mother had played when he was a child. He played with the windows open, letting the music drift out into the November night. He didn't care who heard. He didn't care what consequences might follow. For the first time in years, he played with complete honesty, pouring into the music all his grief, his guilt, his love for the culture that had shaped him, his rage at a world that demanded lies in exchange for survival. The music flowed through him, and for those hours at the piano, he felt clean. In January 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and rumors circulated about the discovery of Nazi concentration camps, Mabel Kress organized a memorial concert. She worked quietly at first, meeting with other students in coffee shops and dormitory rooms, compiling lists and coordinating logistics with the meticulous attention to detail that made her an excellent sight reader. She called the event __quote_59__ and scheduled it for a Friday evening in late February in the conservatory's main recital hall. Not some basement hideout or off-campus venue, but the institution's most public, formal performance space. One afternoon in early February, she came to Elwood's office during his consultation hours. She knocked softly and entered when he called, carrying a folder thick with papers. She looked different than the frightened girl who had arrived at the conservatory 18 months earlier. Her spine straighter, her gaze direct, her movements purposeful. "Professor Whitmore, I need to ask you something important," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Will you participate in the memorial concert?" Elwood set down the letter he had been writing. Another inquiry to the Department of Justice about Virgil's fate. Another letter that would likely go unanswered. __quote_62__, he said carefully. Mabel opened her folder and spread several pages across his desk. Lists of names, program notes, repertoire selections. A proposed statement of purpose that made Elwood's throat tighten as he read it. "We're going to play the music they tried to silence," she said, her voice steady but intense. "Every student who disappeared, every piece they were punished for loving. We're going to perform it all in one evening. Publicly. In the conservatory's main hall, not in some basement where we can be ignored or dismissed. We're going to say their names, explain what happened to them, and honor their courage by playing the music they loved the way they would have played it, with complete honesty, regardless of consequence." Elwood felt fear grip him like a physical force. This was beyond reckless. This was open defiance of the unspoken rules that governed wartime academia, a direct challenge to the institutions that had crushed 19 students for doing precisely what Mabel now proposed to do on a grander scale. "The administration will never allow it," he said quietly. "As soon as Dean Harrington sees this program, he'll shut it down, and you'll be expelled before you can finish your degree." "They will allow it if you support it," Mabel replied, leaning forward with an intensity that reminded him painfully of Virgil. "You have seniority, respect, reputation. You've taught here for over 2 decades. If you're willing to perform, to lend your name and authority to this concert, they can't easily forbid it without revealing why. And if they do forbid it, if they openly admit they're suppressing memorial music for students who were taken from us, that revelation itself would be damning. The newspapers would cover it. Parents would ask questions. The truth would come out." Elwood studied this young woman who had transformed from frightened student to fearless organizer in less than 2 years. "Mabel, you understand what you're risking? This isn't just your degree. This is your entire future in music. Once word spreads that you organized a concert honoring students accused of disloyalty, no conservatory will hire you, no orchestra will take you, no music school will offer you a position. You could be investigated, questioned, your family harassed. Your father's farm. Didn't you tell me he supplies grain to military bases? Contracts could be canceled, questions raised about his loyalty. This could destroy not just you, but everyone connected to you." Mabel met his eyes without flinching. "Yes," she said simply. "I understand all of that. But I'd rather have no future than live as a coward. I'd rather risk everything and speak truth than spend my life knowing I stayed silent when it mattered most. You taught me that, Professor Whitmore. You told me music without truth is just noise, that playing safely is a lie,
That honest performance is worth the risk.
I believed you then. I believe you now. I'm not sure I wanted you to learn that lesson quite so thoroughly, Elwood said, attempting a weak smile. Too late, Mabel said, and smiled back fiercely. Besides, you were right. I've watched students for 18 months tiptoeing around German music like it's contaminated, playing Brahms apologetically, treating Schubert like a guilty pleasure. We've let fear dictate what we perform, how we perform it, what we're allowed to feel. And every time we do that, we betray not just the composers but ourselves. We become complicit in the erasure of truth. The same truth Virgil died for. The same truth Estelle was imprisoned for. If we don't honor them now, if we don't stand up and say that they were right to love German music and wrong to be punished for it, then their suffering meant nothing. And I can't accept that. Elwood agreed to perform. The concert was scheduled for late February. Word spread through the conservatory, then through Pittsburgh's musical community. Some faculty members resigned in protest, refusing to be associated with what they viewed as seditious activity. Parents withdrew their children from the school. The Board of Trustees held emergency meetings, debating whether to cancel the event or allow it to proceed. Dean Harrington, caught between institutional pressure and personal conviction, finally made a decision. He would allow the concert, but with conditions. It must be framed as an __quote_75__. All publicity must emphasize the educational nature of the event, and a faculty committee would review the program beforehand. Mabel agreed to the conditions, then promptly ignored most of them. The program she submitted to the committee was mild and scholarly. The program she actually planned was anything but. On the evening of February 23, 1945, the conservatory's recital hall filled beyond capacity. Students, faculty, local musicians, even some reporters drawn by whispered rumors of controversy. The stage held a single piano and a list of names on an easel. Virgil Brenner, Estelle Vogel, Clement Fischer, 17 others. 19 names. 19 disappeared students. Mabel opened the concert with a brief statement. We gather tonight to remember musicians whose love of truth was stronger than their fear of consequences. They played music honestly, spoke about culture openly, and refused to pretend that art has no connection to the traditions that created it. For this, they were taken from us. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they're alive. But we know they were right. Music does matter. Truth does matter. And tonight, we honor them by playing the music they loved, the way they would have played it, with complete honesty, regardless of consequence. The concert lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. The recital hall's wooden seats creaked as audience members shifted positions, wiped tears, gripped each other's hands. Student after student performed the repertoire that had led to their classmates' disappearances. Brahms' intermezzos that spoke of autumn and loss. Schumann's Kinderscenen evoking vanished innocence. Schubert Lieder about wandering and exile and longing for home. Bach preludes and fugues demonstrating the mathematical perfection that underlay German musical thought. Hugo Wolf songs capturing the psychological intensity of German Romanticism. Between pieces, students read brief statements about each missing musician, their aspirations, their talents, their final performances before federal agents came. Mabel read about Estelle Vogel, a soprano who believed Schubert's Winterreise expressed universal human loneliness that transcended any single nation's claim. She sang Der Lindenbaum and was taken away for it. A bass player named Friedrich Schumann spoke about his cousin Clement Fischer, a violinist who said music was international language, that borders didn't exist in the realm of sound. He organized this concert series. He's been gone 16 months. Each testimony added another layer to the weight of absence in the room, another name to the litany of loss. The audience sat in stunned silence throughout, many crying openly, some gripping handkerchiefs so tightly their knuckles went white. Several older faculty members left quietly, unable to bear witness to institutional failure laid bare. But most stayed, compelled by something larger than comfort: the need to remember, to acknowledge, to refuse the convenient amnesia that lets injustice fade unmarked into history. Elwood performed last, as the program's final offering, the culmination toward which the entire evening had been building. He walked slowly to the Steinway Grand at center stage, feeling his 68 years in every step, in the slight stiffness of his knees, in the way his back protested the 100 times he had made this walk before. The stage lights were hot on his face, making him squint slightly as he settled onto the piano bench and adjusted its height with familiar precision. He chose the Brahms Intermezzo in A major, Opus 118, No. 2. The piece Virgil had played at that basement recital, the music that had been his student's declaration of principle and his death sentence. Elwood placed his hands on the keys and paused for a moment, gathering himself, thinking about the young man who had sat in his studio 2 years earlier with fire in his eyes and music in his soul. Then he began to play, not cautiously, not apologetically, not with the restraint he had counseled for so many years. He played as Virgil had played, with profound emotional honesty, letting the music speak of loss and longing and love for a cultural heritage that transcended borders and politics and the temporary madness of nations at war. His fingers found the familiar patterns, but this time he wasn't simply executing notes. He was bearing witness. To Virgil, who had died too young for music he loved too deeply. To Estelle, whose voice was stolen in a Montana camp. To Klaus Zimmermann, whose hands were broken in Philadelphia in 1917. To his mother Greta, who had stopped speaking her native language in public and carried that silence to her grave. The intermezzo's opening measures emerged tentatively, almost questioningly, as Brahms had written them, a gentle probing into emotional territory. Then the middle section bloomed into passionate declaration, the melodies soaring over rolling arpeggios that seemed to gather force like waves building toward shore. Elwood's hands moved with the muscle memory of 40 years at the keyboard. But his mind was elsewhere, in memory and grief and something approaching transcendence. He played for all the students he had failed to protect, for all the music he had been too afraid to defend, for all the years he had chosen safety over integrity. When the final chord dissolved into silence, that characteristic Brahms fadeaway, notes evaporating like morning mist, the hall remained quiet for 3 heartbeats. 4. 5. Then applause erupted like a dam bursting, sudden and overwhelming. People stood, some stumbling to their feet as if pulled upward by invisible strings. They shouted, "Quote 79" through tears, embraced strangers in the seats next to them, clapped until their palms burned. Elwood stood at the piano, looking at those faces, students he had taught, faculty members he had worked beside for decades, strangers from Pittsburgh's musical community, even a few conservatory board members who had stayed despite pressure to boycott. And for the first time in years, possibly in his entire life, he felt something approaching absolution. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, wouldn't claim it, but a sense that he had finally done what he should have done years earlier. He had played forbidden music publicly, without apology or equivocation, refusing to let fear dictate what could be honored and what must be hidden. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about liberation, permission to feel fully, to acknowledge complexity, to refuse the simplistic narratives that war demanded. Elwood stood at the piano, looking at those faces, and felt something like redemption. He hadn't saved Virgil, hadn't saved the 19. He had been complicit in their persecution through his silence. But here, now, in this hall, before these people, he had done what he should have done years earlier. He had played forbidden music publicly, without apology or fear. Too late for those already lost, but perhaps not too late for himself, not too late for the students still here. After the concert, a young woman approached him. She wore a press badge and carried a notebook. __quote_80___. He nodded. underscore underscore quote underscore 81 underscore underscore. Elwood considered his answer carefully, then decided careful answers were what had created this situation. Quote 82, he said bluntly. Quote 83. Quote 84. Quote 85, Elwood said. Quote 86. Quote 87. Elwood thought carefully. Quote 88. The reporter scribbled rapidly. Quote 89. Elwood met her eyes. Quote 90, he said quietly. Quote 91. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The conservatory's controversial concert had made national news, sparking debate about civil liberties during wartime, the treatment of German Americans, and the relationship between art and politics. Some praised the courage of the students and faculty who had spoken up. Others condemned it as disloyal, inappropriate, dangerous to morale. The FBI investigated Elwood, interviewing him twice. His apartment was searched, his correspondence examined. They found nothing actionable, no evidence of espionage, no contact with enemy agents, just a music teacher who believed Brahms mattered more than propaganda. The investigation was eventually closed without charges, though the file remained in his permanent record. Dean Harrington, facing pressure from the Board of Trustees, asked for Elwood's resignation. Elwood refused. He had tenure, academic freedom protections, and growing public support. Several prominent musicians had written to the conservatory defending him. Students had organized petitions. The administration backed down, though relationships remained strained. Of the 19 students on the memorial list, 12 eventually resurfaced after the war ended. 7 had been held in internment camps in Montana and South Dakota, facilities designed for German and Italian Americans suspected of disloyalty but never charged with crimes. Their educations interrupted, their careers derailed, they slowly rebuilt their lives. Some returned to music, taking teaching positions at small schools or playing in community orchestras. None achieved the professional heights they might have reached if their studies hadn't been disrupted. 4 had been drafted despite medical exemptions and sent to labor battalions, essentially military work camps where German-American soldiers performed manual labor under guard, unable to fight but required to serve. They returned damaged, psychologically and physically broken by years of abuse and suspicion. 3 died during the war, 2 from illness in the camps, 1 from a work accident that may not have been accidental. 7 were never accounted for. Their files remained classified, their fates unknown. Elwood searched military records, contacted government agencies, wrote letters to congressmen. He found nothing. Virgil Brenner was among the 7 never found. Elwood never learned what happened to his best student, whether he died or survived somewhere under a different name, broken beyond recognition. The not knowing haunted him for the rest of his life. Estelle Vogel returned to Pittsburgh in late spring of 1946, stepping off a Greyhound bus at the terminal on Liberty Avenue with everything she owned in a battered cardboard suitcase. She was 24 years old, though she looked a decade older, gaunt and hollow-eyed, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had lost its youthful bloom, her hair prematurely streaked with gray at the temples. She wore a cheap cotton dress that hung loose on her thinned frame and walked with the careful, measured steps of someone whose body had learned not to draw attention to itself. Her soprano voice, once capable of soaring effortlessly through Schubert's highest registers, had been damaged beyond repair by a respiratory illness contracted in the Montana internment camp. She found work as a clerk in Kaufman's department store downtown, measuring fabric and making change for housewives buying material for new curtains. She lived in a boarding house on the south side, sharing a bathroom with 3 other women, eating meals prepared by a landlady who asked no questions about the past. One day, she came to visit Elwood at the conservatory. They sat in his studio, drinking bitter coffee from the faculty lounge, struggling to find words. "Do you still sing?" Elwood asked gently. Estelle shook her head. "Can't. The camp doctor said I had pneumonia, but they didn't treat it properly. By the time I was released, the damage was permanent. I can talk, but I can't sustain notes anymore. My range is gone." Elwood felt tears sting his eyes. "I'm so sorry. If I had stopped you from performing that Schubert song, if I had warned you more strongly—" "Then you would have killed the only thing that made me who I was," Estelle interrupted. "Professor Whitmore, I was in that camp for 18 months. It was hell. Cold, hunger, guards who enjoyed humiliating us, constant interrogation about our loyalty, our families, our beliefs. But you know what kept me sane? Music. I couldn't sing. They forbade it, said it disturbed the camp routine. But I could hear it in my head. Every day I'd go through entire song cycles mentally. Schubert's Winterreise, Schumann's Frauenliebe und Leben. I'd remember every note, every word, every emotional nuance you taught me. That music was my refuge. Without it, I would have gone mad or given up entirely. So don't apologize for teaching me to love it. You gave me something that sustained me through the worst experience of my life. My voice is gone, but the music is still inside me, and that matters more than you know." Elwood couldn't speak. Estelle continued. __quote _97 __. She left soon after. Elwood sat alone in his studio for a long time, staring at the Steinway, thinking about what it meant to be a teacher. He hadn't protected his students from suffering. Perhaps he couldn't have, regardless of what he did or didn't say. But he had given them something that sustained them through suffering. He had taught them that music mattered, that truth mattered, that living authentically was worth the cost. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all a teacher could do in a world where power crushed the vulnerable and systems destroyed the beautiful. Give students tools to create meaning. Give them love for something larger than themselves. Give them the courage to live truthfully, even when truth brought pain. The system had broken Estelle's voice, but it hadn't broken her spirit. The music Elwood taught her had preserved her humanity through degradation. And perhaps, in the end, that was the only victory possible. Not avoiding suffering, but surviving it with soul intact. The years passed. The war became history, then memory, then abstraction. Elwood continued teaching at the conservatory through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. He never again counseled caution to students whose passion for music exceeded safe boundaries. He taught them to play truthfully, to honor their cultural heritage, to refuse compromises that diminished artistic integrity. Some of his students became successful performers. Others taught music in schools and churches. A few abandoned music entirely, finding the professional world too cutthroat or compromised. But all of them remembered the lessons about truth and courage, about music as resistance to dehumanization, about the moral necessity of authentic creation. In 1952, Elwood received a letter postmarked from Seattle. It was written in shaky handwriting on cheap paper. "Professor Whitmore, you don't know me, but I was Virgil Brenner's roommate at the conservatory. I was there the night the federal agents took him. I need you to know what happened. Virgil was sent to a camp in Montana like others, but he got sick. The rheumatic fever that kept him out of military service flared up again. The camp had no proper medical care. He died in January 1944, 2 months after his arrest. They didn't notify his family because his file was classified. They buried him in an unmarked grave in the camp cemetery. I know this because I was in the same camp, working in the administrative office. I saw his death certificate, marked cause of death, cardiac failure due to pre-existing condition. They knew he was too sick to survive the camp. They sent him anyway. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know. Virgil Brenner existed. He was brilliant and brave and died for the crime of loving music too honestly. Someone should remember him. Someone should bear witness. I hope you're still teaching. I hope you're telling students to play truthfully, the way Virgil did. Because that's the only way to honor people like him. To keep creating authentic art, refusing to let fear silence beauty. Thank you for teaching him. Thank you for not stopping him from being himself, even though it cost him everything. Sincerely, A.M. Elwood read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. Virgil Brenner, dead at 21, buried in an unmarked grave in Montana for the crime of playing Brahms with too much feeling, for speaking publicly about the value of German culture, for refusing to pretend that music had no connection to the traditions that created it. That evening, Elwood went to his apartment and played the Brahms Intermezzo in A major. He played it for Virgil, for the young man who had understood that authentic artistry mattered more than safety, that truth was worth dying for. He played with the windows open, not caring who heard or what they thought. When he finished, he sat at the piano in silence, hands resting on the keys. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," he whispered to the empty room. "But I promise I'll keep teaching others to be brave like you were, to play honestly, to refuse the lie. That's all I can do. I hope it's enough." Elwood Percival Whitmore retired from the Allegheny Conservatory in 1963 at age 66. He had taught piano for 42 years, trained hundreds of students, witnessed 2 world wars and the Cold War, seen McCarthy-era paranoia replicate some of the same patterns of suspicion and persecution he'd fought against in the 1940s. His retirement party was attended by former students from across 4 decades. They played a concert in his honor, a program of German Romantic repertoire performed without apology or political anxiety. The cultural climate had shifted. By the early 1960s, German music was no longer controversial. Brahms and Beethoven had been reclaimed as universal treasures rather than enemy culture. The camps were acknowledged, if not dwelt upon. The excesses of wartime fear were beginning to be examined critically, though the process would take decades. At the reception, several of his former students spoke about what he had taught them. Mabel Kress, now a professor herself at a conservatory in Boston, said, "quote underscore 101 underscore. A man named Frederick Schumann, who had studied with Elwood in the early 1950s, added, quote underscore 102 underscore. Elwood listened to these testimonials and felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in his students' achievements, gratitude that some had found his teaching valuable, but also persistent guilt about those he couldn't save, those who disappeared into camps and graves, those whose potential was destroyed by the very system he had been part of. After the party, he went home to his small apartment. He had moved to a quieter neighborhood, a place with a view of the river where barges still carried steel and coal, though the industry was beginning its long decline. He made tea and sat at his mother's old upright piano. He thought about Virgil, about Estelle, about the 19 names on that memorial concert program in 1945. He thought about Klaus Zimmermann, beaten behind a dormitory in Philadelphia in 1917. He thought about all the students over 42 years who had passed through his studio, some flourishing, some struggling, some lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. What did it mean to be a teacher in a world that periodically went insane, where fear trumped reason, where systems crushed individuals for political expedience? He had spent decades grappling with that question. He still didn't have a perfect answer, but he had learned this: you teach truth as best you understand it. You honor beauty regardless of its national origin. You encourage students to live authentically, even when authenticity brings danger. You can't protect them from a hostile world, but you can give them tools to navigate that world with integrity. You can teach them that music matters, that culture matters, that truth matters more than safety. And when the world breaks them anyway, you can honor their courage by continuing to teach what they died for. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to balance the scales of injustice. But it was something. And sometimes, something is all you can offer. Elwood died in 1968 at age 71. His heart simply stopped one evening while he was reading in his apartment. The funeral was small. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. But former students came from across the country to pay respects. They buried him in Allegheny Cemetery, not far from graves of Pittsburgh's industrial barons and cultural leaders. At the funeral, they played recordings of German Romantic piano music he had loved. No one protested. No one questioned the appropriateness of honoring a teacher with music from the country we'd fought twice in 50 years. The cultural anxiety had passed, or at least temporarily receded. After the burial, a dozen of his former students gathered at a restaurant. They shared memories of his teaching, his sternness, his unexpected moments of warmth, his insistence on honesty above all else. Someone said, "He carried so much guilt." About the students who disappeared, the ones he felt he should have saved. But he didn't understand. He did save us. Not from the system. Nobody could save anyone from that. But from losing ourselves. He taught us that music is how you stay human when the world tries to make you into a machine or a coward. That lesson got us through the war, through the camps, through everything that came after. Another added, "I visited him a few years before he died, asked him if he had regrets. He said yes, regretted his silence in the early years, regretted not speaking up sooner, not defending students more vigorously. But then he said something I'll never forget. He said, 'But I can't change the past. I can only teach truthfully going forward and hope that makes some small difference in someone's life.' That's all any teacher can do. Plant seeds and hope some of them take root." They raised glasses to their teacher. To Elwood Percival Whitmore, who had taught them to play Brahms without apology, to honor their cultural heritage without shame, to create art honestly regardless of political fashion. To a man who had failed his students in some ways, but given them something irreplaceable in others. To a teacher who had learned, slowly and painfully, that courage matters more than safety, that truth matters more than survival, and that music is a form of resistance against everything that diminishes humanity. The system broke students, but music, taught with love and integrity, helped them piece together the fragments. Not completely, not without scars, but enough to keep living, keep creating, keep passing beauty forward to the next generation. And that was Elwood's legacy. Not perfection, not heroism, but the stubborn insistence that music matters, that truth matters, that living authentically matters even when the cost is high. He didn't save Virgil Brenner, didn't prevent the 19 disappearances, didn't defeat the system that crushed people for cultural pride and artistic passion. But he taught students to love something larger than fear. And in a world that demanded lies and conformity, he eventually taught them to tell the truth through music. That truth didn't prevent suffering, but it gave suffering meaning. It transformed persecution into testimony, silence into song, loss into memory that refused to be erased. 19 students disappeared in the 1940s, but the music they loved still plays. The traditions they honored still live. And somewhere, in every honest performance of Brahms or Beethoven or Schubert, their voices still sound. Faint but persistent, reminding us that beauty survives brutality, that art outlasts authority, and that courage, however belated, matters more than comfort. Years after Elwood's death, when archivists were cataloging his papers for the conservatory's historical collection, they found a folder labeled simply ___quote, _05__. Inside were clippings from the memorial concert, the letter from Seattle informing him of Virgil's death, programs from student recitals spanning 2 decades, and a handwritten note dated 1966. I failed to protect them from the system. But perhaps I succeeded in giving them something worth protecting. Love for music that transcends nations, beauty that survives persecution, truth that outlives lies. If one student learned to play honestly because I taught them to, then perhaps my silence was not complete betrayal. Perhaps teaching truth, even belatedly, counts for something. The folder also contained a photograph, creased and faded, of a young man at a piano, hands poised above the keys, face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression of quiet determination. On the back, in Elwood's careful script, Virgil Brenner, 1942, before the world broke him, before I failed him, He played truth when others played propaganda. He loved music more than safety. He was braver than his teacher. May his honesty be remembered when my cowardice is forgotten.